Tēnā tātai, kua hui hui mai nei ki tēnei o ngā hui topa, ko te hui topa tuawha. Tēnā tātai, ka timatata tātai nei hui i te karakia. Tēnei te manawa, tēnei te ora, ko tō manawa, ko tōku manawa. Ko te manawa nui o rangi nui e tui hōnei, o papatōnuku e takato nei, hei mai, hei manawa kura, hei ora. Uhi, wero, tau mai te mairi, haumi e hui e, tai ki e. Tēnā tātai kua tai mai nei ki tēnei o ngā hui. Welcome to the fourth webinar series for He Waka Eke Noa. So, anei ngā whakaritinga, just a couple of housekeeping, to use the chat box for comments only and use a Q&A for questions to the presenter. So those are pretty much it for this session. So welcome. Ka tuku te rākau kia te ahorangi Professor Linda Tuhiwai-Smith to introduce our presenter for today. Tēnā tātou. Ana, kei a koe te rākau, Linda.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome back for those of you who've already participated in our earlier webinar, and welcome to those of you who might be joining us for the first time. This is a series of webinars, and each one, I think, has provided a great deal of substance and food for thought and opportunities for people to ask questions. So today we have a very distinguished guest, Sir Professor William Pou Temara. And it's his birthday today, so we can start by saying happy birthday, kia koe Pou. And basically, I think Pou has said that he can really talk, and we've put a time limit on him. But many of you will know of Pou. He is the leading exponent, really, of tikanga Māori and in many settings as a tohunga, and he is well known across Aotearoa as a living, working, practicing tohunga, and at the same time he's a teacher, educator, mentor, and has some really cool ideas. So I just want to welcome you all and hand over to you, Pou. Kei a koe.
My tech is helping me with my presentation this afternoon. Thank you very much, Tuhiwai, for the introduction, and for those of you who are listening in on this talk. Tēnā koutou katoa. I've chosen the topic for my talk today, and deliberately made the topic Te Kuia I Tipu Ake I Wainga Nui I Tāne Mahuta. The kuia that grew up amongst the trees of Tāne Mahuta. And the reason why I did that is to demonstrate the spirituality that this kuia had. And the kuia that I'm talking about is the person that was responsible for my upbringing, for looking after me. In fact, I regarded my kuia and krua as my father, my mother and father. That topic heading tells you that I'm going to be talking about her in relationship to the spirit of the bush that we all grew up in, and that she was part of for much longer than I was. And I'm going to cut straight immediately now to my second. How do I do that? Oh, and there we are. Now, I want the listeners, the audience, to concentrate on the woman that's got her arm around the younger woman sitting down. It's not a good photograph. It's a photograph from way back that I found amongst all my my files, and I don't have too many photographs of my kuia nor of my grandfather. Lots of my mother. The person sitting down is my mother, and the baby on her lap is me. So the concentration at this time is on the woman standing behind her. That's my grandmother. This photograph was taken in 1948, towards the end of 1948. So I must have been about 10 months at the time of the taking of this photograph. It wasn't too long after that this photograph was taken that my grandparents took me away from my mother, or took away the influence of my mother and sent her on her way with my father to find employment in Rotorua. So my life then revolved around my grandmother and my grandfather. I don't have too much to remember about my mother at a young age. I always regarded my mother as the woman who comes to visit us every now and then, and likewise my father. But my life revolved around my grandparents, and especially my grandmother. So that's a photograph. I'm not too certain how old she was at that time. And I want to cut to the next photograph. There. Oh, yes. And in talking about my grandmother and the special gifts that she had, it's important, I think, to lay a foundation, a whakapapa, as to who she was. These are her parents. This photograph is much older than the photograph I've just shown you previously, but it's a neat photograph that I managed to get out of the whare nui in Ratahuna. But it is the parents of my grandmother. The person standing up is Te Tuhera Te Kurapa, and the one sitting down is her mother, Matahira. The significance of that, and it's important for me to talk about the significance of the photographs that I'm talking about, is that she is the daughter of Te Mauniko. And Te Mauniko has the distinction of being one of the survivors of Ōrākau, with her father, the Tūhoe chief, Te Whenuanui, who is credited with leading or being the leader of the Tūhoe contingent. It was a small contingent from Tūhoe to the Battle of Ōrākau in 1864. So Te Mauniko went with her father to the battle, and a younger sister who died at Ōrākau. So this woman in front of us, Matahira, her mother, she is the daughter of Te Mauniko, who is the survivor, one of the survivors of Ōrākau. And that links my grandmother, Pariraututu, to a whakapapa, an important whakapapa. The person standing there, the handsome man standing there, has got my looks. He comes from a very good whakapapa of Ngā Titawhaki in Tūhoe. I want to talk briefly about these two people. I talked about my grandmother's grandmother being a survivor of Ōrākau. The male person in front of you, that is the person who whāngaid, my grandmother, who brought my grandmother up. And he too is a survivor of Orako. And he went on to become one of the important informants to Elsden Best, and the result of that, and the result of interviewing other Tūhoe and Ngāti informants were is the book Tūhoe and the whakapapa book Tūhoe Volume 2. So this Grover has the distinction of being able to remember things. He is credited with recording over, for Elsden Best, over 300 waiata of Tūhoe. The woman in front of you is his wife. Her name is Makurata, and Elsden writes about Makurata. She was a feisty woman, and that's not surprising because formerly she was one of the concubines of Te Kōti Rikirangi. And Te Kōti, as many of you may be familiar, is the warrior leader from the east who led the war against the crown from 1868 to 1972. So Makurata became one of his perhaps the youngest of his wives, but in order for, after he was pardoned, after Te Kōti was pardoned, in order for him to make his way back to Tūhoe, he sent her back with a message to pave the way for his homecoming and for Tūhoe to receive him favorably. She came back. She had an armed group looking after her when she came back as her escort. But what is important about this woman and what my grandmother and grandfather talked about was the great coat that Te Kōti wrapped around her to keep her warm on her horse journey back to Tūhoe from Ngāti Maniapoto, from Te Kuiti. And she came back, and that great coat became a talking point for the tohunga of Tūhoe, who wanted to acquire that great coat as a link to the person that's responsible for the Ringatu faith. So I'm talking about them, so it gives you an idea of where my grandmother gets her Wairuatanga from. For when I was born into this house. This house was built when the Kuia Makurata that you saw in the previous slide was still alive. And she lived in this house for about, with my grandparents. My grandfather built this house for about 70 years before she died in 1835. And the great coat that I talked about hung on the behind the front door of this house. And when she died in 1935, in order for the problem of that the tohunga was squabbling amongst themselves to acquire that coat, for that to end, my grandmother and grandparents buried the coat with Makurata. So when you have a look at that, this slide, I want you to think about the isolation of this slide. This is where the two people in the previous slide lived, and this is where Elsden Best lived with them. And although I don't have too much positive things to say about Elsden Best because of his colonial attitude towards Maori, even after collaborating with these great chiefs of Ngāi Tuhue and Matatua. He still regarded us as less than what we ought to have been, and what we ought to be, and what we are. But the isolation, you look towards the back there, it's bush. So you got bush to the back, bush to the front, bush to the side, bush to the other side. And the only maramatanga was the sky above. The only thing that gives you an idea that it has a link to modernity is the State Highway 38, the road that goes past our place. So this is where I was born into. Behind this house, my grandmother delivered to me in a hole, which is the way that she delivered people, and I will talk about that as we progress. But until I was 10 months, I was then tied behind my grandmother on a team of horses, and we moved from here 7 hours away from here, 2 hours to the end of Wairuatanga, and 6 hours, 8 hours from there, from that, which in 1948 was a castle, to this. Now, this is in the middle of Te Uruwera. This whare that I spent 7.5 years of my, from 10 months to 7.5 years of age, where I spent my life and where I spent my time mainly with that kuia. My grandfather, if you recall the second slide, was a big man. He was a 6'4", and for those times, the 40s, that was huge. He was a giant for those times, and as he grew older, he became wider. But he was a hard man, and being brought up with his Ngāti Pro relations that made him, they taught him things. They taught him a work ethic. He was always working, and my grandmother was always working. Up at 4 o'clock and didn't go to sleep until late at night, and they worked the whole time. And you wonder, in the bush, what did they do? I wonder about that. But we worked. We all worked. And I've retained that culture. I'm always up wide awake by 4 o'clock. I've done my karakia by 4 o'clock, and I'm getting out of bed and I'm working. And that's just part of the culture that you get used to. But that's where we grew up, and that's in the middle of Te Uruwera, in the fastness of Te Uruwera. So I want to show you another photograph. Just imagine in 1948, and prior to 1948, that all of what you see in front of you to the far horizon there was cleared. This is 3.5 hours ride from Maunga Poha to this place here. And we're still in the middle of Te Uruwera, and my grandfather had cleared this place just with a slasher. His relations from Rātuki had helped him, and they had cleared this place and turned it into farmland. And that's why we lived in this place. He lived in that house while he was farming that place, and we ran 400 sheep on this place, all driven up from Rātuki, hard. I recall as a young child, maybe I was 2, but I recall one of the last drives to drive sheep up from Opourio, and we got the sheep from Monty Suter's grand uncle, I think it was, from Opourio, and we drove them up the Whakatane River, and then branched off into this river here to settle the sheep in this cleared space. So, and that's how it was, that's how it is at the end of last year. when we went back on a pilgrimage, when they were doing a story on me. This is how it's gone back to bush. And no, of course, our whare had disappeared in 1964, I think, when we went back there. When I went back there, it had gone in 1964. All right. I'm going to talk about my kuia, and I've got here the topic with the Kireru Te Pou Ake. And I'm going to be talking about Te Pou Ake because the Kireru is representative of Tāne Mahuta. And the way that we lived, the way that my kuia lived, and the way that she acquired her Wairuatanga. Her Wairuatanga was the Wairuatanga of the bush. Look, even though I adore my grandfather, and my grandfather turned me into the tohunga that I turned out to be, and the whaikorero person that I turned out to be, but I have to, when I think about it, and I've been thinking about this for the last 40 years, that much of the credit goes to my grandfather, because I was with her all the time. My grandfather was too busy working, was away from us. And when my grandfather was away, my grandmother became the person that looked after me. There were only three of us, my grandfather, grandmother, and me. So you can imagine that I grew up in a certain way. I became precocious. I didn't follow the usual upbringing of a Māori child of those times, that the Māori child's job was to not to question, not to ask questions, was to listen and to do. I wasn't like that. I spoke in a adult-like fashion when I became older to my grandmother and grandfather, and they spoke like in the same manner back to me. And they didn't talk in a childlike manner to me. They talked to me as an adult, like an adult. And that's how I grew up. Now, I think I may have talked on another talk about my friends became the things that were around me. The kiriru became my friends, the birds became my friends, the dogs that were left to my grandmother became my friends. The horses became my friends. So I'm really good at all the things that I'm talking about. I'm really good with dogs. I'm really good with horses. I still shoe horses now, even at in my mid-70s. I still am able to shoe a horse and break a horse in. So I'm good at all those things now. Nā Wairuatanga, who taught me those things? Yeah, my grandfather, but much of the credit has to go to my grandmother. When we got sick, my grandmother was the doctor, the nurse. My grandmother was the tohunga. My grandfather was the spiritual person, and he wasn't the tohunga that my grand uncle was, but he knew things. So my grandmother was able to go into the bush, and then from osmosis, by observing and by being inquisitive, I was able to determine which were the trees that and the plants that were good for for looking after me. Look, just moving away from that, and in 1977, when I was a teacher in Wellington, we lived in a flat, in a two-flat building, and we had a couple from England that came. The husband was teaching with me. I didn't know what the wife did, but she saw me one day coming out of the bush, and I had these plants with me. She says, "Oh, what are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm getting some plants to fix me up. I got hurt in rugby, and I was fixing myself up. I was all bruised." And she says, "Why don't you go to a doctor?" And I says, "Oh no, doctors can't fix me up in the time to get me ready for the next game." And she said, "Oh, I'd be really interested in what you're doing." And so I thought, "Oh, the whole the park out." But I fixed myself up in no time, and it turned out she was a doctor, And I was a bit embarrassed when I, after recalling that I had told her that the doctors, Pākehā doctors, couldn't do anything for me. And I didn't enter hospital until 2015, when I got cancer. And for me, that was a new experience. But for me, it was Wairuatanga. And all the places that I lived in, all my houses that I bought in my lifetime, all had trees or close to the bush because of that, because I could go. Now, I talk about the silence of the bush. When this kuia, when my grandmother used to take me, I used to be noisy. I used to be asking questions all the time. And she was also a hunter-gatherer. When my grandfather wasn't around and we'd run out of kai, she'd go and hunt. And this is one of the things she hunted, to her teal chicken. Anyway, she'd ground me because I'm always asking questions, and 5 years of age, and I wanted to shoot the pigeon myself, arguing with her to give me the gun, and she threatening to slap my lips or to send me home. And the funny thing is, my grandparents never touched me, but the mere thought of being sent home, of staying home and not being able to follow her to this excitement in the bush was just enough to keep me quiet for a short while anyway. But she taught me the silence of the bush, and she'd tell me, hoi hoi, hoi hoi, pa, got it, the mighty nigga, mahu te noa te kāinga, keep quiet, pa, crikey, you should have stayed at home, should have left you at home. That really hurt me, so I'd keep quiet. And then she'd say, whakarongo, whakarongo. And then I would listen, and the silence of the bush was deafening. And I mean that literally, because it wasn't silent. It was a noisy place. And you could hear the sounds, the different sounds. You could hear the kaka, you could hear the pihi, you could hear a whole lot of things. And she taught me that, to be silent. And right up until just a few years ago, when I am not able to do it as much as I always, that I would like to do, I always used to seek solace, the silence of the bush. Whenever I was struck with problems, I always used to go in all the places that I lived in, Wairuatanga, Wellington, that's why I lived in Wairuatanga, so I can take off into the bush. But if it was serious stuff, I always went back to Land and just disappeared into the bush for a couple of days and listened to the silence of the bush and got myself cleansed again and re-centered myself before I came out again. So that was due to my grandmother. But she knew all these things. She taught me a whole lot of things during the daytime when things weren't, when birds weren't flying around. She, haramai ki a kono koe, let me teach you a song. Oh, I like that. And she'd go, ka tini topi, ka tini maira, tare maira, whakapau maira, ta me tare, whakapoki, taimanatari ana hibo. And I learned that, and I've never forgotten that. And she told me it was a really tapu karakia, a tapu tēnei karakia. And then I worked out later on when I was older that it was a rhyme, a Maori rhyme that she was teaching me just to keep me occupied. But ngā waiata kākonau I te kuia nei ki te waiata kākonau ki nāhaka. So I knew a lot of things about from that kuia. But there were times when our place used to be inundated in the bush by visitors, strange visitors. And I used to go and hide because I wasn't used to them until she'd come calling for me, and then I sort of come out from hiding, getting used to these people who are coming. And when I got used to them, because I was the kind of person that always was inquisitive, I say, "Koi koe, who are you? What are you doing here?" And of course they had come to be administered by my kuia, to be, and I didn't, I had an idea what they were there for. They were sick. And they used to ride up on, they used to be brought up by their husbands or by their fathers or grandparents, you know, to the bush, and for my kuia. And she, you know, when I think about it, she was very young when she was doing this, but she had a certain touch, and that would have come from her whakapapa and from the way that Wairuatanga had settled upon her. And she fixed them up, and I never heard her call it. They used to disappear, and I used to follow. This is not for you. And I used to go and occupy myself, play with the dogs, play with the horses, and play with the birds, and then they'd come back and but she was a midwife, and the fact that she only ever had one child made me believe, why did she become a midwife? You know, I would have thought that people with experience that may have had quite a few children would have been a midwife, more appropriately as be more appropriate as a midwife. But her sister-in-law, she was only young and married her older brother. So there was a huge gap between her brother and her sister-in-law, but they had 15 children, and she always came, or my grandmother always rode in the bush. They were the other family that lived in the bush on the Whakatane River, and she went and delivered the birth there. And sometimes she only knew by Wairua means that she was about due to have a baby, and she'd ride off. I'd go with her, and then she'd deliver it, and all the births were successful. So she had that midwife touch at that very young age, as I'm able to ascertain now. But there were other people. When we came out to Ruatahuna in 1954, we left the fastness of the bush because I had to go to school, 7.5, and I hadn't been to school. But she came out, and my grandfather was more at the Waikare Whenua, and women always used to visit us, and they had different ailments. Some of them he mate wairangi, he mate of the mind, and that they came to her. And I remember an auntie coming to her. She'd just lost her husband, and I think the trauma of that made her sick, and she deteriorated mentally, and she turned up at our place, and she had the habit of just stuffing her. She only wore one article of clothing. It was an overcoat, and she stuffed this overcoat with paper. Whatever she found, she stuffed this. And I always used to say to this auntie, "Kai te hapoi, why are you doing that?" I was so inquisitive, and she'd just look at me, and this auntie would say, "Kai te mate, oh, he pōrangi koe." That's how, you know, that's how, nakedly honest a child could be. "Kai te pōrangi koe." And then you know, so I thought, oh, okay, accepted that and moved on. And then, others used to come and stay with us, And then women who were noted for their taha wairua always used to come. This Kuia, Waka, Rangiahua, her husband was one of the Tatahumas of Rua the Prophet, always used to come and spend a night with my grandmother and grandfather. But now I think about it, was mostly with my grandmother. And I used to hear them talk, and they used to be talking about moi moi, interpreting dreams and all this sort of thing, which my grandmother wasn't, and now that I recall, wasn't that interested in. She was interested in administering to people in the way that she did. So He Taha Wairua is taking them into the bush and doing whatever I never saw it. But I could imagine the healing properties of the bush, because even now I would do that. If things got too serious, I would be back in Te Urewera, talking about, or talking to the bush and listening to the bush and listening to the word of Tāne. But these were halcyon times. But this kuia, she wasn't just about the wairua of the bush. She was also about harvesting from the bush, and observing her. We'd go to a taumatua. A taumatua is a tree that is laden with birds that birds feed off, and she would know what time of the day the birds would be. And when I talk about birds, I'm talking about this bird here, would be maddened with feeding. And they would not be frightened by the presence of humans. And she would go, but she only took as much as we needed. But if there were times that that the birds weren't flying, she would use other means. She would, and that's when she told me, "Hui hui, whakarongo here," and then I would listen, and then I would hear the noise of the silence. It was a noisy silence. You could determine certain things, and suddenly this bird here, kai te whakakeke. Whakakeke is to hide from the eyes from prying eyes, and to stay still and be silent, and to process the food that it had eaten and stored in its the pouch in its throat. That's where the whakatauki comes, feed them until whangaia kia peha te korokoro, whangaia until the pouch of its throat is full. And they would process that. And one way of processing it, part of the process was the defecation of the food that it had processed. And what the hunter was listening for, and what she was getting me to listen to, was the sound of the defecation coming down from the hiding place of the kereru and hitting the leaves on the way down to the ground. And then you'd work out where the noise was coming from, and then you focus on that spot, and suddenly and gradually you would make out the shape of the kereru. Ana, boom, ana, kua takai ho te kereru. And she taught me to have eyes like hers, and as soon as she aimed her shotgun, I was ready to take off. And as soon as the shotgun went, I ran to where I thought the bird would be falling down, and I grabbed it. I caught it like a rugby ball. And the whole idea was to stop it from hitting the ground. And then she went through a ritual. The ritual was to take out, and I could see her lips moving, take out the tail feathers and make a hole in the ground, take out the tail feathers of the bird, stick it into the ground, and then take out the feathers, the long feathers of the wings, and stick them into the ground. And all the time I could see her lips moving. And then I so inquisitive me, what are you doing now? Hoi hoi, kai te karakia. And she was giving thanks to Tāne. And that was the whole idea. Every time she stuck a tail feather, she was doing a karakia, and she stuck all these things, and then she'd cover it. And then we take the bird with the remaining of the feathers. We took them home because the feathers she used were pillowcases and for our bedding. And then there was another ritual. So she taught me this 13-verse karakia for the Māori of the bird. 13 verses of karakia that ensured the Māori of the bird. My grandfather father didn't know that karakia, but my grandmother did. My grandfather was all about shooting it and then sticking the feathers and just giving thanks, but by giving a short karakia. But my grandmother knew the long 13-verse karakia. And because sometimes the mauri of the kiriru used to be taken by Ngāti Hinuru, which are our neighbours to the edge of the Urewera, or by Ngāti Tūwharetoa. They'd come in when their birds were scarce, they'd come in, find the mauri and take it. And the whole idea of the karakia was to bring the mauri back and to bring the birds back to the Urewera. So that was really important. It ensured, it instilled in me the importance of mauri. And when I became of age, when I went to school at Huiarau, she taught me my first words, and I think I've already talked about it. I talk about this a lot, and I forget when I last told the story, but my first words were, "My name is William Tani Pou Temara, I am 7." And I was giving the teacher my only words that I knew in English that she had paid to give me. But her last act, Kuia. My grandfather died in 1967. She died in 1968. I was away in America, traveling the world, very young, traveling the world, because I worked out what a good life this Pākehā life is. I'm going to travel the world. And I did. But whenever I struck a problem, whether I was in Manila, whether I was in Hong Kong, whether I was in Israel, that I was at for 3 months, whether I was in Germany, whether I was in Canada, whenever I struck trouble, she'd be there, telling me how I should conduct myself, what I should do, that I had forgotten something, and I would do it on a kopayo. And so I came back. And when I landed back in New Zealand, I didn't have much money because I was working towards creating myself to be a millionaire. But then my grandfather got in the way and decided that he inappropriate time for him to move towards dying, and I had to come back. And so he died, and a year later, I decided that I was going to join the army to see the rest of the world. It didn't occur to me that I might be killing people, but she knew, I didn't tell anyone, she knew that I was about to go overseas, maybe by the way, or maybe her Wairuatanga got to her, and she was sick at the time. She was trying to fix herself up, but she got things in motion that stopped me from going overseas. And when I found out from my kuia that it was my kuia who had put things in motion to stop me from going overseas, I had a feeling that she knew, she had a premonition that what might happen to me. Because in the end, the person that I told not to take over my position in the company or in the platoon as chief head scout, I told him not to do that. He didn't have the experience that I had, but the army put pressure on him, and consequently he was shot in Vietnam. So my kuia must have had a premonition that that was a possibility for me, and stopped me from going through the John Rongiho. Okay, just want to wrap up now, just to give you an idea how important the place of kuia and women and the upbringing of women. And as I say, people see me as this a person that can wield a taiaha and do somersaults and pirouettes on the marae, and accredit that to my kroga, yes. But my kuia had a lot to do with that. Had a lot to do, had a more than meaningful contribution to that. Look, let me just talk about my kroga. hard man. He was the law in Watahuna. And when he said, when there were trouble and he visited that person and you got the come here, ho, like this, you know, people shivered in there because he delivered on the spot justice to them. He gave them a hiding. He was a hard man. He could fight. And sometimes he used to go kicker in Tuhe speak. That is, he used to go crazy. When he went crazy, nobody would stop him. But it took this kuia, this kuia which is calmed down, this little lady. He was 6'4". She was 5'2" or something, just calm and right down from being this wild, crazy man to just calming right down, and no one could get to my crow except her. And so, yeah, and so I was to think, oh, man, you were great. You could calm that crazy crow who was a tohunga too, but he was a hard man. So I just wanted to end on that, just to say, oh yeah, the way I am is not, yes, contributed to my crow, to the male in my life, but the females in my life were also very, very important. Lastly, met Scotty Morrison this morning at coffee, and he was telling me what he was doing down here. He'd been doing tohunga work down here, and he'd been selected to put up by the South Auckland people to do a part of the work of Muma that amazing kuia had set in motion, and this is to do the matariki karakia. And he asked me if that he wanted to teach women those karakia. I said, well, there's a race between you and I, and the race is who would do it first. So yeah, I said, by saying that to Scotty, I was saying, yes, teach them, because they need to know. And if matariki is going to be a meaning place in our lives, then it has to be the prerogative of everyone, male, female, kuia, tamariki, and all of us in Aotearoa. Kia ora, everyone. Thank you for listening to this kōrero.
Oh, tēnā koe Pou. Thank you for that. It was beautiful as usual, awesome. And yes, you can craft a story with a single photo. That's really wonderful. All right, we're going to, hopefully people have some questions. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. But I thought I'd start with one, Pou, which is, when you left, you know, and went to school, you left living with your grandparents, did you ever go back to them, or was that it? Were you on your journey out?
That's an amazing, yes. Look, I was 15 when I left, because I started late. All the people that my age group, that we were all born in the same year in 1948, Aubrey, Temara, and a whole lot of people, the Birds, they went on and they became leaders. So our group, women and male and female of our year, we were a telling generation, because we went on and we became, Aubrey became a leader, and Dennis became a leader, still is, and these amazing people and amazing women, Hinerangi, good man, you know, people like that, and Miss Molyneux, now, when I left and discovered Auckland, never been to Auckland, and that was the only thing that my parents had when they came to uplift me from Wairuatanga and to take me to Auckland, because they lived in Auckland. And Bombay Hill, getting up to Bombay Hill just on dusk, and lights everywhere, and the sweep of my father's arm as we were going in his American car, and he said, all of that is Auckland. And I followed his arm, and I looked, gee, how big this place is. I wanted to discover it. But I was 15, and the only time I went back to Ruatahana was during the breaks at school. But I actually never went back to live permanently, even now. Yeah. And when I left school, I went to Wakatani because I needed to work to get myself money so I can go overseas. I discovered how good this colonized Pākehā world was. I needed to be part of it. And I thoroughly enjoyed myself. In 1976, I went back to Māoridom again.
Yeah, so what that tells me is that really by the age of 7, you had already been instilled with a great deal of mātauranga, including all the karakia.
Yeah. I was, Linda, I was, and for me, it wasn't unusual. For me, it was normal. The things that my kuia did, now that I reflect, were in today's context, it's so unusual. But then for me, it wasn't unusual. Oh, there goes Nan again doing whatever Nan does. And I wanted to find out, and she kept threatening to slap my lips. But yes, I learned a thing. And one of the things that we're always being commented on when the growers used to get up and do and this kid running around making a nuisance of himself, he used to join them in the haka and all this sort of thing. I've seen that happen somewhere lately in Tūkiterangi's young son. He was only a kid and he was acting like a kaumatu with his toko, while the rest of his group were but I was like that. And yes, and they never forced me to do anything. If I was reluctant to do things, my grandmother and grandfather would say, "Oh, ka pai ke te mokopuna ha mea, mō te mahi," and I used to listen. It was pointed at me. "Oh, gee, did you see the so and so's mokopuna? Can gee, that mokopuna can work, eh?" You know, these. And I used to think, oh, and I'm eating, and then they don't eat too much, so I used to push my kai away and go out and do all this mahi. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question for you from someone, Eridani from Kaitahu. Have a question about a practice my dad, who's from Kaitahu, used to do when I was little, when I was Māwiwi. He would bake a kumara and wrap it up in a little towel thing, and I'd sleep with it. He never mentioned it as a Māori thing. It was just a thing. I read in Hirini Moko Mead's book that this is sometimes a tikanga practice to open a new whare. Is this a familiar practice? I think his mum did it for him, but it was never mentioned as being a Māori thing. I think it is one of those things that maybe the detail skipped a generation.
Yes, well, I gave a talk at the 2.5 hour talk at Wairuatanga a couple of weeks ago, and yes, I talked about the significance of the kumara. The kumara is called Te Kura Mai Tawhiti, which is the treasure from afar. And Te Kura Mai Tawhiti, there are stories, long stories, beautiful stories about the kumara, how the kumara is fashioned as a baby and given to and you can imagine some of these kumara. I saw Che Wilson with a huge kumara that he had planted. And I thought, did our tipuna, were they able to plant things like that and then shape it into a shape of a baby and give it to a mother or to someone who pined? And one of the things about that in the Mapatu area, because the kumara is a very important part of their culture, is the kumara being part of the ritual to enhance the chance of having children for barren mothers. That's one. The other one, of course, is the ritual of whakanua that is done with a kumara, which is part of the ritual of my school of tohunga. And it is also the ritual of the school from Taranaki and the school from Whanganui. So it's what we do, and in order to make everything noa, and to take the teeth out of the tapu. The kumara was heated, and the kumara was then squashed up by the tohunga and thrown over the meeting house. Now, I guess an aside to that, for the person who asked the question, is the prospect of doing that ritual to a 10-story building like Te Papa that we were part of, and they suggested, oh, what about our kumara? Matua? No, who's the idiot who can throw a kumara, 10 stories over a building? No, we'll figure out something else to do. But that's the significance of the kumara. Now, if the person's mother, if the person's mother was sick and given a kumara, I would ascertain, I would, offer that maybe there was it was a process of ritual by which balance was restored, that a hara may have been committed, and the properties of the kumara that made the hara, which is a Wairuatanga thing, go away, might have been used.
Okay, we've got time for maybe a couple of more questions. So I'll ask my other question about your kuia, and you talked about her giving thanks when you're in the Ngahere. What was her use of water? Like when you were Mawiwi, did she also use water, or? Some people kind of sprinkle water and think of, the healing powers, if you like, of Wai. Was that something that she did?
Yes. No, Wai was a great part of our ritual. Let me just... No, okay. That house, our little whare in the bush, I mean, what you saw there was a photo by a Pākehā that had taken that photo a few years after we had abandoned it. And of course, nature had taken over. But that was a really nice, it was all clean in front there because our kuia was meticulous. Anyway, to the, as you, if you can remember the photo, can I bring that up? Yeah, to the left of that was, oops, what have I done? To the right of that, here we go, was a puna. And it was my task to have to go to get water from the puna, or she would conduct the person to the puna. But if the person, who were usually women, if they were too sick to go to the puna, it was my job to go to the puna and get water. Now the puna, the bottom end of the puna was for human consumption. The top end was for mahi tūroro. In other words, that's where you got the water from. It could not be contaminated by the water that you use for kai. Or she would go down to the main river, but it was quite a way down from our whare. Now, I would get this water and ensured that the water got back to my grandmother whole. In other words, when I got there, I used to do a little karakia that she told me to do to get the water, and then having got the water, to do a karakia to make it noa again, and then go back. Tohunga would say that water cannot be tapu because it's noa. Oh yes, water can be tapu, where it flows into the place where the tohunga has created a wāhi tapu, that becomes tapu. As it flows out of it, it becomes untapu. But the danger is that if you don't clear it, then it can be detrimental for people downwards of the of the stream. So the ritual is to make it tapu. After you finish, clear it so that it doesn't. It's not a problem for others. So yes, she used water besides rongoa, and of course drinking the Wairuatanga was good. Didn't work for gout.
Well, did Māori have gout? I don't know, did they? Back in the day.
It's amazing, you know, all the problems that we are having with the COVID and with vaccine. And my sisters from cousins from Wairoho, who are the tohungas and Wairuatanga administering and rongoa Māori, people were saying, or some were saying, no, just get kawa will fix the mate coronavirus up. And my cousin from Wairoho was saying, oh no, he mate tēnei no tawhiti kāre o rai te kawa. This is from offshore, kawa cannot fix it.
Mm.
Go and get vax is what she was saying. Yeah.
Hapai. Well, thank you. Our 1 hour is up.
Yeah.
And on everyone's behalf, Pou, I just want to thank you for a really not just a beautiful talk, but I think something everyone would recognise that we're privileged to hear, and a really special sharing of your kuia. And it's lovely to hear you speak of your kuia, because your voice is warm and you light up when you talk about your kuia, which tells me and tells us that you loved her, and that you had a great love for her and your koro, of course, and that she too played such an important part in your life. So on everyone's behalf, thank you. There's some really good comments in the chat. Someone's saying, I felt I was there with you hunting the kereru and hearing your kuia growling. Thank you for sharing what the deafening silence was. So lots of thank yous in the chat, Pou. And I will now hand it back to Here Aroha to close our session.
Tēnā kōrua, tēnā koe e te pāpā, e te ahorangi, e te tohunga, tā Pou Temara, tēnei te mihi atu kia koe, tino miharo ki te whakarongo ki tō whakatapuranga, I roto te ngahere ana ka tapu hoki koe ki te taha o tō kuia. He kaupapa tino hira. O tira kia koe, Linda, nau I whakahaere I tēnei o ngā kōrero. Tēnā tātou e whakarongo nei I tēnei rangi, ka mutu ki konei, ka mutu I te karakia, tēnā tātou. Hikitia te rongo mai whiti o tēnei huinga, I rungi te huitopa, mo te kaupapa he waka ike noa, tuku a kia ea, tuku a kia oi, ko rangi nui ki runga, ko papatūnapi ki raro, tūturu whakamaua kia tina, haumi e hui e, taiki. Kia ora tātai.